Now, okay, we're live. So, hi everyone, welcome to the first ever Crime and Justice System workshop that I'll be giving exclusive to people on the program server. Actually, it's just joking. I don't mind if you guys share this workshop to other people. The only condition is that you are not allowed to monetize it. Yeah, you're not allowed to sell it to people. Feel free to share with as many people aside from that. Okay, CJS. So first and foremost, what is a crime? I think if you've been debating for a while, you probably would have seen this at some point or another. The definition of a crime is basically an act that is prohibited by law. It is an act that inflicts harm upon another individual or a group of individuals in society. Now, for purposes of this workshop, we're just going to assume that the law as it stands is good. And most of the time, it is true. Like, the legitimacy of the law is sort of a question, like an entire different discussion altogether, how the laws are created, whether laws are legitimate or not. But when it comes down to it, wherever you are, if you live under a state, there are certain laws and regulations that you must follow. And violations of the law are things that we consider crime. And the state is then allowed to use its monopoly of coercive force against you. A crime must consist of two parts, the actus rea and the mens rea. So if any act or like anything, like if you only have actus rea or you only have mens rea, that is insufficient to be considered a crime, and the actions that are taken and like the punishments and all those things that follow. Similarly, if none of these two components are present, then obviously whatever did happen, however tragic it might be, is not considered a crime. So for something to be considered a crime, must have those two components. Actus rea, or guilty act, is the act of committing a crime itself. Mens rea, i.e. is Latin for guilty mind, is the intent to commit a crime. So in order for something to be considered a crime, it must have these two aspects. If it doesn't, it's not a crime. So for instance, if you are generally a racist person, but you don't act on it, so for instance, you don't engage in hate speech, it is not fair for the state to punish you because there's no actus rea, right? Like you're just generally an unpleasant person, but unless you act on those racist intentions or those racist sentiments, the state does not have a basis to restrict your choices. Conversely, if you accidentally bumped into someone and they fell down the stairs and broke their arm, it's not fair for the state to punish you because there's no intention for you to cause harm. There's no mens rea. Yeah, I hope that's clear. This is not really related, but I think I'll just mention it just because. That when it comes to establishing liability, there's a different criteria that can be met here. So it can sometimes be not considered, like you may not intend to hurt someone, but because it was your responsibility to protect that person, i.e. the state imposes a duty of care on you, if you neglect that responsibility, that can also be considered a crime. I think the most intuitive example I can think of is the locus parenti doctrine or the parens patriae doctrine, which basically says that as a parent, you are legally responsible for the welfare of your child. So even if you, let's say you leave your child in the car unattended alone and the child gets like sunburn or something, you may not have intended to cause harm towards your child, but because you had a responsibility to care for that child, neglect in this case can be sufficient as a reason to prove mens rea. Right. Next, the criminal justice system. CJS is a set of legal and social institutions for enforcing the criminal law in accordance with a defined set of procedural rules and limitations. Generally, there are four main goals: retribution, rehabilitation, deterrence, and protection. The four goals are interconnected. Any changes in policy affects all four in different ways. Retribution. The first pillar of the CJS is that all actions must have consequences, an eye for an eye. This means that sentences passed should inflict a degree of suffering on the criminal. For instance, incarceration is a restriction of your freedom of movement. Fines is a financial punishment, sort of taking away your like capital and stuff. Whipping is like corporal punishment is reserved for the worst of crimes, for instance, rape. Punishment inflicted must be proportional to the crime committed. So it's unfair to punish petty theft with the death penalty because the punishment is far worse than the crime. And it's unfair to punish rape with like 2 weeks in jail. It's hardly any punishment for the severity of the crime committed. So in order for the CJS to have its legitimacy and have efficacy, people need to believe that the CJS is fair or like relatively functional. And if punishments are disproportionate to the crime, that shows a clear like intent for the state to abuse their power or like their monopoly on coercive force. And that's when they're likely to lose the legitimacy or lose the faith and the support of people, which is really important when it comes to enforcing the law and all that. Right? Now it's time to watch Infliction of Pain. Yep. So that's an example of caning and pain, the infliction of pain. So I hope it's clear. Punishment in the CJS is no joke, and it is intended to inflict pain and suffering on people in order to protect society and deter other people from committing crime. Yep. So why must the degree of punishment be proportionate to the severity of the crime? Social contract theory says that the state is only justified in restricting your rights to a certain degree. That's why criminals that violate the rights of other people give up their rights to the same degree and no more than that. There are also a number of other inalienable rights that you will always have as a member of democracy. So like the right to a free trial, the right to freedom from torture, things like that. You will never lose all rights in the democracy. However, the extent to which the state takes away your right is determined by the extent to which you have violated, your role or you have violated the laws, basically. Over punishment destroys the soul of the criminal. So if they re-enter society, they'll find it difficult to be a normal person. They will want revenge against the state. So clearly, if you feel, as in if you know you have done something wrong and you feel you are clearly being over-punished for it, this means that you no longer have the incentive to like accept your punishment and then move on with your life. Over-punishment really like it just destroys you as a person. And given the massive power asymmetry between the state and the individual, it is really, really important that the state be held accountable by virtue of the fact that there is no other system to hold to hold the state accountable here. Conversely, under punishment reduces deterrence for committing crimes. Victims that lose faith in the CJS may take justice into their own hands, for instance, form vigilante groups, refuse to cooperate with police in investigations, underreport crime if they don't feel anything will be done. So at the same time, under punishment means that the CJS is not effective in punishing things, and that's why it loses its legitimacy and loses its efficacy of protecting society. Why is retribution important? Firstly, because just retributive justice, I think is quite intuitive to believe that if you've done something wrong, if you have inflicted a harm upon someone else, then you deserve to have harm inflicted upon you as well. Secondly, is because of deterrence. It's necessary to dissuade people from engaging in criminal behavior if you know that you will face a degree of harsh punishment. Thirdly, is because of victim closure. So people who have been victims of a crime want to know that the person who has harmed them is facing the consequences and facing some semblance of fairness in the world. The fourth is in order to protect the integrity of the system. So as I mentioned earlier, if there are no harsh consequences to committing crime, society loses faith in the CJS to be able to protect them and will be unwilling to work with the system and may choose to actively work against the system. In fact, it has happened in most situations where retribution is unevenly distributed. Okay, the next pillar of the CJS then is rehabilitation. So the process of rehabilitation is basically attempting to change a criminal for the better. It is forward-looking or like looks to the future, which is to say that unless you sentence someone to life or you give them the capital punishment, criminals will eventually re-enter society. The question therefore is what is the best way to prevent them from committing crimes again? Rehabilitation aims to avoid recidivism, which is a situation where criminals leave the system and commit crimes again, in like some cases even committing worse crimes because like the prison systems that they were exposed to are extremely harsh and don't have sufficient rehabilitative measures. So rehab focuses on understanding the root causes of crime and seeking to overcome them. So there are many reasons why people commit crime. Systemic reasons include poverty / lack of education or skills / lack of functional welfare, which means that people who are poor and desperate and have no other option but to opt for crime. Second is because of negative peer groups and gangs. This is quite prevalent in situations where gangs have a lot of power, and when there are not a lot of healthy alternatives, especially for the youth. Third is because of a lack of moral upbringing or childhood trauma. These are people who are, so to speak, damaged and have a lot of extensive trauma. They don't process the hurt in ways that are productive, but also because they've been hurt in the past, they're more willing to inflict hurt on other people. The rehabilitation model seeks to rectify these problems and remove the incentive for individuals to commit crime again in the future. Right, so what do these rehab programs look like? When it comes to re-education and vocational programs, these are systems where prisoners are enrolled into a program of their choice, where the end goal of programs is to learn marketable skills that they can use to seek and retain employment outside of prison. So there are a lot of examples here that I hope you can just remember like 2 or 3 of them that you can drop in debates. Things like barbering, building maintenance, carpentry, like good trades, painting, plumbing, food service, culinary arts, horticulture, custodial maintenance, upholstery, that's the stuffing the cushion, auto detailing, masonry, welding, heating, ventilation, air conditioning. These are all programs that exist within the US prison system that prisoners can enroll into. I'll just note outside of this from a debating perspective that the status quo where prisons exist, these services exist, like they're there, but the extent to which they're effective depends a lot on the amount of funding that the states put into those programs. Secondly is the incentives for criminals to opt into these programs and to find these programs actually functional in helping them. Like this differ across the board because just because those programs exist doesn't mean that they're executed successfully and well. However, if you're on the side that is defending rehabilitation or defending prisons for that extent, you have access to this magical concept that does not exist in reality called fiat, where you can say by fiat, we will increase funding towards rehab programs and make them a lot more effective, and obviously then achieve the outcomes to a greater extent than what is achieved in status quo now. But so obviously you have fiat to increase funding, but what you spend that money on, you need to list a couple of examples here in order to make that intuitive connection that vocational training can work. Right, so re-education and vocational programs, it is very cost effective. With a $1 investment in prison education reduces incarceration costs by $4 to $5 during the first 3 years post-release. So this is a very important statistic. It is true, you can fact check it. But it's important for you to prove that focusing on rehabilitation is actually cheaper than attempting to punish criminals harsher. And in most situations, this means the state has more funds to invest in other forms of infrastructure. But generally across the board, it's just required for you to show that rehab is effective. And just to bridge that intuition gap that a lot of people in debating have, and just generally don't buy into the concept of rehabilitation. Second, inmates who participate in correctional education programs have a 43% lower odds of returning to prison than those who did not. Employment after release was 13% higher among prisoners who participated in either academic or vocational education programs than those who did not. However, participation rates are not high. Up to 48% of inmates do not register for any such program. Like again, for a lot of reasons, the most common one being that these programs are so underfunded that they're just absolute shit. Which is why prisoners don't feel it is impactful, or like people who have registered for those programs don't find that they aren't really learning a lot of things, and therefore might still choose to opt for recidivism instead. So these are reasons why people don't sign up for it. The point here is that it's not enough for you to say that we want to fix criminals and all that. In order to prove and show that the likelihood of rehabilitation succeeding is firstly quite real, but secondly, quite significant in terms of the ways it impacts society, these statistics and these facts are necessary for you to prove that. So especially when it comes down to debates where one side says rehab's functional, the other side rehab says it's not functional, the way to break the deadlock is to look at real world statistics, and you can take these examples, like write them in a fact sheet somewhere, and pull them out during CJS debates in order to help you win those clashes. I hope that's clear. Okay, so types of rehabilitation systems. When we talk about counseling and support structures, there are two types, secular and religious. In terms of secular support structures, criminals often suffer from past trauma and mental health issues. So this looks like psychologists and therapists that are willing to work with criminals to talk through their issues and try to resolve them. Even if no resolution is achieved, research shows that the forming of social relationships and opening up to another person have a positive impact on their mental well-being. I mean, it's quite intuitive to believe. Like having friends just means you are happier than isolating yourself and staying alone all the time. Support groups also continue outside of prison, similar to Alcoholics Anonymous. Convicts and ex-convicts read out regularly to support each other and help each other facing issues. So very common issues that criminals face post-prison is finding employment. These support groups can be instrumental in connecting ex-convicts to employers that are willing to look past your criminal record and willing to give you a second chance. In the absence of these connections or like opening up these opportunities, it is very, very likely that criminals opt back into crime by virtue of not having better options. Right. Similarly, there also exists religious counseling and support structures. This looks like religious organizations sometimes organizing outreach programs for prisoners. So it can look like pastors and religious leaders coming to prison to offer spiritual counseling to prisoners, together with food, supplies, minor luxuries, etc., as incentives for them to join the program. Prisoners can opt for spiritual counseling and receive some solace from God. Some prisoners choose to convert to a religion and try to become a better person through religion. So religious institutions like churches and the communities can often become support structures outside of prison. So if you are fortunate enough to have a strong religious community that does have a prison outreach program, after you leave prison, it is easier for you to rebuild social connections and find like friends and support structures in that religious community. So that can be a positive thing. When it comes to religion, it's a bit controversial because the obvious incentive for religious organizations to go into prisons is to recruit people to join the religion. However, like all things, agency is debatable, choice is debatable. The extent to which it actually helps people, even if there is a degree of coerciveness, if it does lead to better social outcomes, I guess it can be justified in that regard. But it's just important to know that these things exist and you can bring them up as examples in debates. Okay, the last part of rehabilitation is the reintegration into society. And as I flagged earlier, criminals will eventually leave prison and re-enter society. And once they come out of prison, the factors that push them into committing crime in the first place will still exist to a large extent. And in order for them to overcome the temptation to fall back into crime, or the pressure to fall back into crime in some instances, they require gainful employment and they require social support structures. There's a lot of stigma attached to criminals that make it difficult for them to find gainful employment. I think intuitively this is just true. Like employers may not want someone who has a criminal record in their company because they just discriminate against them, just prejudice against them. But just realistically, this results in more than 27% unemployment rate in the US if you're an ex-convict, which is higher than the US average, was like, I think 20-something% before the COVID pandemic hit, which is one of the highest in the developed world, actually. Reasons for this is often very low levels of education and little marketable skills, and you often have to compete with other applicants without a criminal record. Stigma also leads to discrimination in the communities. It's difficult for them to form social relationships with people, and isolation is highly likely to push ex-convicts back into crime. So in order to successfully reintegrate and to leave your criminal past behind, you require a set of skills and you require a set of characteristics and attributes. These are things that rehabilitation seeks to give to you as a person so that you become a better functional member of society and that you no longer inflict harm upon others. Post-prison support systems. This looks like housing services, legal services, employment services, support groups, telephone counseling, face-to-face counseling, drug and alcohol programs, childcare system, parenting skills training information, mentoring programs, domestic violence safety plans, and emergency relief. Inmates are 10 times more likely to suffer from an antisocial personality disorder, 2 to 4 times more likely to suffer from psychotic illnesses and major depression. Like these are all just reasons why, the reason why you commit crimes is because you have a mental condition to begin with. But after you're released from prison, those conditions don't go away and they still affect you, which is why you need to have access towards the proper services that prevent you falling back to crime. Care after prison, CAP, CAP. Very easy to remember acronym. It is a national peer-led criminal justice charity supporting people affected by imprisonment. So if you need an example to show, post-prison support systems, you can always look to CAP as an example. They provide peer mentors, community support workers. So like it's similar to Alcoholic Anonymous, like you meet up every week or every 2 weeks or so. Just talk about your lives, ask for problem, ask for help for your problem, or just share your problems with people that are able to relate to it and understand it, and sort of creating this safe space for people and help them heal and grow and become a better person. Like most of the time, people that leave prison don't want to go back, obviously because prison is quite harsh, but it can be difficult for them to live in this world. And that's why those support systems are really, really, really important. Okay, the next part of the CJS then is about deterrence. At this point, does anyone have any questions? I'm going to assume no. All right, deterrence. It is a disincentive for people who may have committed crime, but choose not to for fear of the consequences, right? So just because there's harsh punishment, you choose not to commit crime. There is general deterrence, which is the threat of legal consequences for committing crime on the general public. And there's also specific deterrence, which is the threat of legal consequences of committing crime on ex-convicts and individuals who have been through the system before. Generally, deterrence in debates is quite difficult to prove because you have to factor in that most criminals don't expect to get caught. So the best way to prove deterrence is to show strict and consistent enforcement of the rules, which proves that deterrence can work in a majority of situations. I mean, you'll always be able to claim a comparative value of deterrence, especially with harsher punishment and stricter enforcement, but you will never be able to prove 100% deterrence, and that's why it can be a bit difficult to quibble about it in debates. Ooh, play. Right. That was oversimplified under prohibition. It's a very interesting, I don't know quite historical education program. And it's quite insightful as well. So if you want to learn history and you don't want to be bored to death, oversimplified is quite interesting. But I hope that explains deterrence well. Yeah. Okay, there we go. The last pillar of the CJS is protection. So the criminal justice system cannot just be reactive to crimes that have already been committed, but must also be proactive to prevent future crimes from happening. So they do this in a lot of ways. Firstly, through deterrence, like they just discourage potential criminals from committing crime. Secondly, through rehabilitation, which reduces the risk of criminals committing crime after going through the system. And thirdly, through incarceration, which is the prison system generally, that removes and isolates criminals that pose a direct threat to a society in prison. So this is how the CJS protects people in society. That are all the mechanisms here. All right. The last part about this is I just generally want to talk about the process of justice. So even when you're arrested, even when you're accused of a crime, criminals have access to a few basic rights. So this ties into what I said earlier about individuals never losing all of their rights in a democracy. You will always have the right to a fair trial. You always have the right to due process, to seek redress or legal remedy. You will always have the rights to participation in civil society and politics, such as freedom of association, the right to assemble, the right to petition, the right to self-defense, and the right to vote. The right to vote is controversial because in some nations, criminals don't have the ability to vote. But I guess in most of the time, criminals just don't have any incentive to vote. Like, why would politicians care about your vote, right? But from a principled perspective, you should always have this right. It is fundamental and inalienable to you, which is afforded to you by virtue of you existing in a democracy, like social contract and stuff. So if states restrict access towards these kinds of rights, specifically for criminals, that is clearly an overreach of state power and an abuse of state power because you are taking away the basic inalienable protections that human rights affords towards people. And that's why due process is really, really important. It holds the state accountable, holds the state in check, and makes sure that people who go through the system are treated fairly and justly. And obviously, this doesn't always happen in society, especially if you're Black, but it is what the world should be like. Related to this, the presumption of innocence. Courts are bound by the maxim of innocent until proven guilty. This protects the accused from having to prove their innocence, which places the burden of proof on the prosecution. It allows the accused to remain silent and not testify to incriminate themselves. This means that prosecutors must prove beyond a reasonable doubt the guilt of the accused before they are sentenced. It is just morally better to let 100 guilty men walk free than it is to unfairly punish one innocent man. Right. This is also important, especially when it comes to tyrannical states, because the courts and the criminal justice system are the arms of the autocratic state when they want to shut down political dissent and like political crimes. They'll just accuse you of any number of crimes and you'll just get locked up. You have no recourse. The presumption of innocence was created specifically to prevent that, to prevent state overreach. So if the state wants to take away your rights, if the state wants to inflict punishment upon you, the burden is on the state to prove that you deserve to be punished, as opposed to the burden being on you to demonstrate that you do not deserve to be punished. The reason for this is because the burden of proof is a barrier, right? And this barrier existing means that you, as the prosecution, you may not always have sufficient evidence to meet this burden, which means you won't have enough evidence to, get this person punished and convicted and stuff. And that is a good thing because it protects people that otherwise would be targeted by the state, that otherwise were just living their lives and just were doing nothing, and now we're locked up and they're sent through the entire system. That's why presumption of innocence is really important to protect people. Okay, aggravating and mitigating factors. We have a lot of debates about such and such should be considered a mitigating factor in debates. Recently, I was at a tournament that we had around about cultural differences or your cultural background being a mitigating factor. So basically what this asks is that after a court has determined a defendant's guilt, the punishment or a sentence is then determined by the court. Aggravating and mitigating factors are circumstances unique to a crime that could extend or reduce the severity of the sentence of an offender. And I just want to note here that aggravating and mitigating factors does not change whether the determination of guilt. So in the process of determining whether or not a person is guilty, we don't take these factors into account. These factors only come in after you have been determined to be guilty in deciding the severity of the sentence to impose upon you, right? So these are factors that can change things. Common aggravating factors include being a repeat offender, the vulnerability of a victim. So this is why child rape is punished more severely than non-child rape, I guess, normal rape. Of course, both are bad, but the rape of children is worse because of the vulnerability and the lack of ability to protect themselves. Third is leadership role. So if you are the ringleader, you can be punished heavier. If you are just like the kakia, then you may not necessarily be punished that severely. And fourthly, a hate crime. Hate crime is you do something because you hate someone because of unchangeable characteristics. And that's just not something we should support as a society. Conversely, mitigating factors. If you are a first-time offender, you may be granted leniency. If you only played a minor role in the offense, you may also be granted leniency. Past circumstances like trauma or mental illness, which reduce your culpability, can also reduce your punishment. And fifth is genuine remorse. Yeah, that's actually a thing. If you have been shown to truly been remorseful, the CJS sometimes takes that into account. I think this is most often factored into restorative justice hearings, where like most criminal cases is you go to court and like, are you guilty or not? And then like, how much punishment you're going to get and stuff. Restorative justice is where you sit down with your victim's family, your victim / their family, and you attempt to redress the harm that you committed upon them. And genuine remorse is a prerequisite to entering restorative justice hearings, because obviously, if you don't intend to make reparations, then there's no point going through that, and you're just inflicting worse harms upon the victim. Yeah. So if criminals meet these criteria, the sentence that is imposed upon them can be reduced, potentially be reduced. I would note that this does not mean that you get no punishment, and this also does not mean you no longer have a criminal record. It just means that the duration to which you spend in the prison is reduced as a result of this. Okay, so I guess that concludes the workshop for CJS for today. Anyone have questions?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Yeah, how do you like determine like real remorse, like genuine remorse?
How to determine remorse?
Yeah, because
Um,
it's very subjective, right?
yeah, correct. I mean, most things with regards to the law and judiciary are quite subjective as well. So, okay, so the process of triggering a restorative justice hearing, it needs to be agreed upon by both the prosecution and the defense. So either one can propose it and both needs to agree to it. And obviously, in order to get someone to agree to a restorative justice hearing, because like once you agree to this, you cannot midway default and say like, I don't like this, let's go back towards a punitive hearing. You cannot do that. So in order for you to opt for a restorative justice hearing, you sort of need to believe that the criminal is genuinely remorseful for their actions. And obviously, there are a lot of other different circumstances that can play into the situation. It's like maybe they truly were desperate. Maybe the reason why they committed a crime was because out of necessity, like they just needed the money for a medical procedure. Like they could have gotten it through other ways, but they just panicked in the moment and stuff. Like these are all circumstantial factors that play into the situation that can show that a criminal truly is remorseful. And obviously, it's not a perfect system, but most of the time, a genuine expression of remorse, like an apology and an intention to provide reparations, is enough to like gauge remorse of the individual. All right, great. I'll just end the recording here then.